Hey everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and today's video is going to be a little bit different because I'm talking about two headphones instead of one. Normally I just have a dedicated review for every product I cover, and that's typically the way that I think most people prefer it because you just want to learn about that model. I already filmed an Elite review recently actually, and the goal was to do it in very close relation to my Empyrean II review because I wanted to get a really solid understanding of how they compare to each other. It became more apparent as that video went on and as I was filming this review as a standalone that it's important to, I think, compare both of them quite often because it's the only way to really paint a picture of one, what the Meze sound is the new sound better or worse, is it just different, and how it compares to competitors as well, because I will also be talking about the ZMF Caldera and the HiFiMan HE1000 at the end. So instead of doing like 3 separate videos, it makes more sense to put it all together, and that's where we are. Now the Elite's been out for a while, and it's a gorgeous headphone. You know, when you look at the specs and what you get for the price, it's definitely a premium product, and for a lot of people, it's their end game headphone. You know, this is $4,000. The Empyrean II is the latest lineup from Meze, and it's $3,000. They made some upgrades, which now include a much nicer cable. The older Elite used to come with this cable, which is, you know, still a decent wire. It's better than what a lot of other companies have provided in the past. But when I look on the website now, it actually shows the same description that the Elite 2 or the Empyrean 2 shows, sorry. So I think going forward, you're going to have the new cable. You also get a new case on the Empyrean 2, so I'll do the case technology or case discussion afterwards to compare to the metal one. But there are some similarities and differences in the specs. Now both headphones have a 32 ohm impedance, which is good. It makes it easier to drive to an extent, but sensitivity is another huge part to that picture. I've had higher impedance headphones that are very easy to drive compared to, you know, low impedance, low sensitivity stuff. So the 32 ohm is great, it's a good start, and it's typical to a planar magnetic headphone. Usually you get mid-20s to, let's say, up to 40 ohms or something. But the Elite, so this has a sensitivity of 101 decibels, and the Empyrean II has a sensitivity of 105 decibels. Interestingly though, when I hooked them up to multiple amps, it's not just one amp, I got more volume at the same setting on the Elite than I did on the Empyrean. It seemed like if I was using the Empyrean to do my A/B testing and then I switched over to the Elite, my Elite was just slightly louder than my Empyrean. So it doesn't quite line up with the sensitivity rating. I have no idea what else is causing that, but I just want to share that personal anecdote. Now the drivers themselves also have some similarities and differences when it comes to the specs. They both are Renaro drivers, and although you can't see the traces here, I'll show a picture on the screen. There are 2 different trace designs. So you have a switchback design on the higher portion of the headphone driver, and there's a circular pattern or a spiral pattern on the bottom. The idea of that is switchback typically has better performance in the bass department, and a circular driver diaphragm will tend to perform better in mid and higher frequencies. At least that's kind of, you know, the marketing and technological explanation from Meze on why they did that. Now the driver dimensions are the same. It's 102 millimeters by 73 millimeters. However, there is a change in the driver itself as far as a diaphragm weight goes. The Elite has a diaphragm weight of only 0.11 grams, and the Empyrean II is 0.16. They have a different name for the diaphragm as well. The Elite has a diaphragm that's called the MZ3 SE, and the Empyrean is the MZ3. Very similar design, but they have a slightly different acoustical performance, which we'll get into in a moment. Comparing the cases between both of them, the Elite has a much larger aluminum case, and if I pop this open, normally you would have the headphone and the cable, of course. You know, I'll put that there for a dramatic effect. But you do have 2 different pads. You have the Caldera pads, which are actually angled a little bit, and they have a different feel and obviously sound characteristic. And then you have the hybrid pad, which has a blend of Caldera on the inside and real leather on the surface. It's also a thinner pad. Going into the Empyrean II case, it's a bit more compact, as you can tell. It's a little bit thicker, but it might just look that way because it's a smaller case in general. You have a different design for the pad storage, and this again, the Caldera pad is really nice. I find these extremely comfortable. But the pad that it comes with installed, the hybrid pad, I absolutely love. So I'll talk about the pads in a minute. Now, normally this only comes with 1 cable at the $3,000. Meze sent me all 3, and one's attached, so when I grab the headphone, you'll see that one. So when I pull these out, there's different lengths depending on what cable termination you have. This is the XLR, of course. This cable is absolutely gorgeous, and the website description actually shows this cable being included or mentioned on the Elite. So I think future and new units will use this cable too. And you can choose, you know, if you need XLR or a 4.4 Pentacon, which is what this guy is, or the standard 3.5 millimeter should you use a single leaded amp. Now I want to talk about build quality and comfort because this is kind of at the forefront with Meze. They are stunning. I think that the Elite, the Empyrean II in general are some of the best looking headphones I've ever seen. It's a subjective thing, obviously. You may or may not like the look, and that's totally fine. But I like the all black design on the new one. It's a little bit more subtle. Even the grill design is slightly different compared to the Elite, but they're both pretty tasteful in their own right. Now I think the Elite and the Empyrean are both gorgeous. This is more of a personal preference thing. The Elite is obviously much more flashy. You have this like Beskar looking metal if you're a Star Wars nerd out there. But it's gorgeous, and the polish is just right to still have a shine to it, but it's diffused enough where you don't really get fingerprints or like a harsh reflection either. So it's shiny enough, but tastefully done. Now I'm going to turn my scale on here. We'll zero it out just to make sure, and I want to show you the weight difference. Now, I think the Elite by itself, the chassis is just slightly heavier, but these pads are a little bit lighter than those. So I'm getting 432 grams on the Elite. I switch over to the Empyrean II and put that on the same scale, and I'm at 456 grams. So it weighs a little bit more, but I think part of that is coming from the pad. You don't feel it either way. They're both just insanely comfortable, like more comfortable than most headphones I've ever used. Part of that has to do with the headband design, which distributes weight very evenly. It's very breathable. You can wear hats, although obviously I don't recommend it. This is just for the video. Then you factor in the pads, which are excellent on pretty much across the board. You know, all of these are very easy to switch thanks to that magnetic mount design, which is great and extremely convenient. So you can switch pads around in case you want to swap this onto the Elite or vice versa. The geometry of the headphone also helps with comfort. It's not just weight, which is fairly light, being in the low 400s, considering it's a big planar magnetic headphone. They typically weigh more. So they kept the weight down. They have insanely comfortable pads. The geometry of the headband is nice. But the yoke geometry, like the way it puts pressure on your head, it's just the right amount of spring tension, and it's the same thing with this. They really dialed in the comfort for the past few generations of Meze. They know what they're doing here. And I think that combination, in addition to the weight and the pad, is why this fits my head so well. It's a giant oval-shaped pad, so it's going to fit larger ears, but the oval isn't as large as a Hi-Fi headphone either. So you should be able to maintain a more consistent seal depending on your head shape. Now when I look at the pad dimensions, this is again just going with what the typical pad installation comes with, you know, like what these come with by default. I'm at about 74, 75 millimeters of pad opening on the Empyrean II and about 45 millimeters of width. If I go over to the Elite pad, I get closer to 50 millimeters of width. This is probably closer to about 48 maybe for what would actually touch. And if I go at the height, it's 80 millimeters of height. They're both large, and even going by the depth, I mean, you're getting over 20 millimeters of depth. This is like 21, 22. I go to the Empyrean II, and I'm approaching 30 millimeters of depth. These are huge pad openings. Most people with various shapes of ears and sizes are not going to have an issue with either one. Now, both of these have a 2-year warranty for Meze, at least in the US, and everything with these headphones, both of them, are user serviceable. There's no glue, there's no one-time use component that requires you to be stuck with it forever. Everything is serviceable. You have removable screws here to detach this carbon fiber band. The strap is replaceable. The forks, the yoke, everything could be swapped out. It's not that it's designed to fail and that's why it's easy to swap out. They just believe that when you're spending this much money, it should be user serviceable and extendable, because this is not a 1-year purchase. I used to work in Magnolia a long time ago, like 20 years ago now. I guess I'm dating myself, 15 years ago. And one thing I always used to tell people is spend more on the analog stuff, the stuff without electronics, because that ages much better than anything with a battery or a chip or a processor. Good sound is pretty much always good sound. So when you think of buying a very expensive product like this gets approaching to like the heirloom type stuff, you know, something that you hang on to for years and maybe pass down to a friend or a family member as you move on. So the idea of making it serviceable but also making it built extremely well is important in this price range. You don't want to spend thousands of dollars and, you know, have it fail. That even translates over to the cable. I mean, like, it's little things like the mechanism to release the mini XLR interface, the way the termination happens, everything is built to another level. These cables are about $400 a pop. So depending on what you have or what you're upgrading to, they're not cheap. I'm not going to get into the whole, there's a drastic sound quality improvement from cable to cable. I think this has a great balance of not having any microphonics. It's flexible, it's the right length. I think it looks good, it feels good, and it should last a long time. So I think that's really where I put more stock into buying premium cables. It's all that, and not so much the sonic difference. Now it's time to talk about sound quality, and there is a massive difference between the two and also how they compare to some other brands. So the Elite is like the known Meze Audio house sound. They have always been a somewhat warmer sounding headphone that isn't so forward in the upper mid-range and treble to be like sibilant or ear piercing. It's a different presentation than what something like, you know, the HiFiMan HE1000 SE goes for, which is much more neutral and light in the bass region, but more analytical and forward in the upper mids and treble. Now the Empyrean II is kind of a departure from what people have known about the older Empyrean and Elite sound profile. If you have either of those headphones and you're thinking that maybe this is just a minor tweak of that, it's very, very different. And it's different enough that if you like the comfort of the Elite or the Empyrean, but you want a different sound, you could actually get the Empyrean II and have two pretty different, like drastically different sound presentations. Even though the bass is comparable, it sounds different because of the way the rest of the mix is. There is a little bit more of a bass shelf with the Empyrean II. It comes across a little bit stronger, and with some tracks seems like it has more bass. Now there is a massive emphasis improvement or increase from 2000 Hertz to 6000 Hertz. That is the most noticeable change with the Empyrean II, because now you're starting to approach a warmer sound profile that is more V-shaped, because it has a more emphasized treble to go with it. When you look at the frequency response, it becomes very apparent how different these can sound. If you're familiar with these measurements and you know what they mean, you can see that it's not just 1 or 2 decibels here and there. It is a different presentation, and I think they have their own strengths, but the Elite is more of like a refined version of the Meze house sound. It sounds darker, but it still sounds wide, advanced, and vast, I should say. It's good at doing instrument separation and detail retrieval, but not so much from a forwardness standpoint, more of a like a macro dynamic level. So if you have a really busy track, the Elite is still going to do an incredible job at pulling out every single nuance of the track, and the sound signature is, I guess, the final delivery, but it's still doing an excellent job of allowing you to hear every single thing at its own, you know, presentation layer, if you will. Now, I also measured the Empyrean II with the new suede pad, and I wanted to show you that measurement as well. It rolls off the bass shelf. It's a smoother bass profile. So if you want to approach something that has a more technical or analytical sound, because the bass is reduced as much as it is, it's just by default going to make the upper mids and treble sound more forward. Now, it's not as bright sounding in the 2500 Hertz region. It's slightly smoothed over, which some people will like, because if anything, it can tame the shout a little bit, but there is a lift compared to the rest of the mix when you look at, you know, the 6,000 to 8,000 Hertz region. That can make certain things sound a little bit more lispy, or, you know, if someone has a whispery voice, it's going to emphasize that portion of their voice, you know, something that has a higher pitch trailing note to it, for example. Personally, I prefer the stock pads. Not only are they incredibly comfortable, but it has a sound profile that to me just works with more genres of music. I didn't find myself wanting to switch pads just to get that sound signature, because I can always, you know, make subtle tweaks with EQ later. But from out of the box, that bass lift really helps if you're listening to rock music, if you're listening to hip hop and EDM, or even something like jazz where you want that bass note to keep up with the rest of the instruments. Now, purely from an objective standpoint, the ZMF Caldera measures a little bit differently as well. It has a leaner bass profile, almost like the bass profile of the Empyrean II using the suede pads, but it's then followed by a more similar sound profile to the Empyrean II in the upper mid-range and treble. It doesn't come on as fast in the 1,000-1,500 Hertz area as the Empyrean II does, but there is a pretty drastic rise when you go straight to 2,000 Hertz. It's a little bit snappier, voices have a little bit more bite to them, but at the same time, it still sounds a little bit more vast, slightly thinner sound presentation. When you look at the HiFiMan HE1000 SE, it is a very different sound profile. It's just as lean as the Caldera. If anything, it's more lean, and then you have a much more analytical and brighter upper frequency to go with it. So if you're chasing something that's neutral bright, the HE1000 SE is going to adhere to that more. Now I want to talk about how these sound from a subjective level, what I observed, and I think this will help translate to kind of what the byproduct is of how these measure as well. Now I don't use just audiophile tracks because that's not what I listen to every day. I do enjoy hearing the technical prowess of a high-end equipment, but at the same time, I'll listen to Eminem and I'll listen to heavy metal or techno music, whatever it is, just whatever I'm in the mood for, and that is important as well. So I want to start with Bob Marley. Turn Your Lights Down Low. It's a classic song. I think everyone knows what that sounds like. These present that song so differently from each other, even if the bass can be somewhat similar, which is apparent. That deeper note that's happening on the bass line sounds excellent. What is most noticeable is the Elite has a wider, almost like you're sitting in a cabana outside and there's just some people with you. Obviously they're not talking, but you're listening to it in a different environment. It sounds slightly forward in the mix. His voice is a little bit softer and more blended in with the rest of the stuff that's going on. Everything's just laid back and chill with the Elite. Now it still sounds like wide and vast, but a darker wide presentation, if that makes sense. Where if you go with the Empyrean II, this is a more traditional audiophile headphone listening experience. Because the vocals are emphasized more, it's much more in your face. Bob Marley's voice is much more forward in the mix. It's standing up with some of the other notes that might be going on around him. And it's a little bit more intimate sounding while also sounding more energetic. So again, it just kind of depends on what kind of sound profile you're looking for. It's not that one's necessarily better than the other. You're just hearing a very different experience between the two. So let's switch gears and go a completely different direction. I want to talk about the song Passenger by the Deftones. And Maynard James Keenan, the lead singer of Tool, sang on that song with the Deftones. It's one of my favorite rock songs of all time. He just absolutely slays that song. The Elite, like I said, is more laid back, and I liked that song more on the Elite because when you tend to turn that song up a little bit, which I do more with speakers, you get a more forgiving listening experience. I was kind of alluding to this earlier, is there can be a lot going on in an audio mix, and the Elite is going to keep up. But at the same time, it's not hitting you with so much energy that it causes you to turn it down. Listening fatigue is a real thing. And when the guitars pick up and he's singing and just belting out his notes, the Elite's presentation was just absolutely amazing. I love listening to that song on the Elite. The Empyrean's not bad. The difference is his voice, it has more bite to it. It's more forward, and the guitars with that are also more forward. So I don't want to say it's taken away from anything else going on in the mix. It's just a more energetic, brighter presentation. Now at lower volumes, I actually liked this, but for how I like to listen to that song, I'm not talking deafening volumes, but when you crank it up, the Elite was an easier listen for heavy metal and rock in general, and it really became apparent on a song like that. Now going another direction again, let's talk about the song What Was I Made For by Billie Eilish. Very slow song, not a lot going on. It's really about her voice, and the Empyrean II brought Billie Eilish's emotion like right into your soul. It's so much more captivating to listen to on the Empyrean II. It just sounds absolutely incredible, and thanks to that bass shelf to go with it, you're really in the zone, in the moment of that song. The Elite, because it was darker and because of the way Billie Eilish's voice is, that trailing I don't want to say lisp, but the trailing wispiness of her voice, the tears in the voice, if you've ever heard that term before, is more emphasized. So while the initial tone that's kicking off her vocal is not as forward as it is here, the trailing parts of her voice, where you get that softer S or breathy part, is more emphasized on the Elite. It's not that it sounded bad. It was, I guess I don't want to say hypnotic sounding, but a little bit more, I guess holographic. I don't know. I think because the voice is less forward, it just sounds very different and wide, but it also sounds extremely dark. Again, cycle is repeating from earlier, but I liked listening to songs like Billie Eilish's mix more on the Empyrean II. I just like that forwardness and grip that it has on the song. Now, I want to talk about an EDM track from an artist called Rez, R-E-Z-Z, and it's called Hypnocurrency. The opening bass riff of that song is just ridiculous. It's such a subtle demonstration of power, if that makes sense. It's not a busy track. There's not really anything else going on, but you can just crank it. In fact, the hard part about that song is it tempts you to turn it up to build that emotion and suspense and connection to the bass. If you haven't heard that song, give it a shot, even if you don't like EDM. These present this very differently. Now, on speakers, when you have subwoofers and floor standing speakers, that song's great because you turn it up and you can feel the suspense in your chest physically. And planar magnetic headphones are pretty much the only headphones that can really deliver that bass level on an open back side, to still get the wide stage and naturalness. The Empyrean II seems to have more pressure and weight in the low frequencies, like the sub 20 hertz. You can feel that cycle of pressure on your ears, the impact or interaction that your ears have with the driver. It's just absolutely incredible, and it shows you how much power these headphones really have. When you go to the Elite headphone, it's not as deep, but it sounds a little bit thicker and heavier. So it's a different type of demonstration of power, and they're both good in their own right. Now, as the song kind of gets a minute or so in and it's really picked up and you have that more traditional EDM, dubstep style sound, the Empyrean II, I think, has a sound profile more people will gravitate towards for that type of song, at least for the first few tracks you listen to, because it's much more energetic. Synths just stand out more. It's more punch. It's more of that club feel, where the Elite is still good, but it's much more laid back and reserving. Now, if you're 10 or 15 songs into an EDM song, let's say you've listened to the Elite for a half hour to an hour on the same high energy stuff, you might find that sound profile is better for an extended listen because, again, it's not as fatiguing. It's a warmer, darker presentation. And then if you switch back to the Empyrean II after that, you're like, holy cow, this has way more energy. I still like the Empyrean II more for EDM just because I don't listen to it at extreme volume levels, even though it's tempting if the right song's on. But it's just a more energetic, traditional EDM sound, what people typically expect an EDM song to sound like. The Empyrean II gets closer to that. Now, the crazy part is when you start comparing it to other headphones in this price range, you get very different experiences, not only from a looks perspective, which is very apparent, but the sound presentation is different, and as is the comfort. The HiFiMan HE1000 SE was like one of my first high-end headphones I ever owned, and I like it because it has some of the most incredible detail retrieval I've ever heard on a headphone. And even though $3,500 is a lot of money, it's exceptional even at $3,500. You just hear everything. Now, some people don't want that. Some people don't want neutral bass with a bright sound. I don't really see it as a fault as it is, when you shop a premium vehicle or an exotic car, they do things differently. It's not so much that one is better than the other, but the HiFiMan is definitely the cleaner, brighter sound. If you listen to a lot of music that's dark or you don't like a lot of bass, this is still going to be a very rewarding headphone. The clamp force is actually quite nice. The weight isn't that bad either. It's actually still a fairly light headphone. It's more clampy than these, but I can still wear this for a long period of time. The ear pad openings are huge, and I think this is a little bit more, comes down to your head shape and your jawline. I never had seal issues with the HE1000, but I know because of that larger style pad, some people may have a different fit right here, which can impact your bass. I do love that though. I mean, I go back to it often for a reason. Now, the ZMF Caldera, I purchased these because I loved it that much. And, I've reviewed this in the past. I try to not be like a fanboy when I reviewed it because I owned it, but I bought it for a reason. It's a planar headphone that's an open back that doesn't do everything the way a traditional planar open back does. It has some of the nuances that bring it closer to a dynamic driver headphone as well, usually with the attack and decay just being a little bit softer. It can sound very natural for music. Now, the coloration that it has in the vocal region, by having a dip at 1000 hertz and really picking up in the 2000 hertz region, it has a little bit more bite. I don't want to say shout, but it definitely gets closer to that level of being very forward and snappy in the vocal range. The rest of the timbre is excellent though, and I find that the extended treble in the 15,000 hertz and up region is quite nice. It has a good sense of space to it, but because of the way it's tuned in that vocal region, it doesn't have the same warmth or depth that either Meze product has. So it just kind of depends on what your sound signature that you're looking for is. It is not as resolving as this. In fact, the HE1000 is crazy resolving. I don't think I have it out. I have the LCD-X from Odyssey as well, and these all make the LCD-X sound darker and less resolving, which is pretty crazy because that's still a really good headphone. I love the ZMF Caldera, and I bought it for a reason, but the clamp force is definitely stronger. So if long listening sessions and comfort is one of the things you're concerned with, this is noticeably heavier and has a much stronger clamp. I do love the way these sound. There's definitely a reason why I have them, but that's something to keep in mind. I also think they're gorgeous as well. They're just very different than the more modern and sleek looking Meze products. So you really can't go wrong with any of them. It's just a matter of, I guess to an extent, style preference, but from a sound quality perspective, they all present it very, very differently. Now I'm just going to talk about source audio very briefly because these are all very easy to drive. Meze products don't need a lot to scale to get the performance they're capable of, and because they're easy to drive, you can literally get away with a $10 to $50 dongle and be good to go. Now, I've connected these to an Xbox controller, which only has about 30 milliwatts at 32 ohms. Use the FiO K11 DAC amp, which I absolutely love, at $130. The niche Pitus Maximus, which I asked to keep and purchase after my review because this is probably one of my favorite amps of all time, especially for the price at $600. It's just such a ridiculously good amp. And this has the DAC built in. Then there's the niche DSHA-3FN at the bottom, which doesn't have a DAC built in like these two do, but it's a $3,000 amp. And it has a nice warm punch to it, something that the Meze products don't quite need. So the pairing, while it was really comforting to listen to, I didn't felt like I needed to go to that level. I was actually really happy with the more punchy niche Pitus Maximus and even the K11, which has a clean presentation. It really plays nice, and because again they're so easy to drive, you really don't have to buy anything too extreme on that. I would focus more on the connectivity, you know, if you need certain features or power output. Otherwise you're pretty much good to go with anything you own. So that about wraps up the video, and I hope the comparison between the Elite and the Empyrean helped make your decision on either, or maybe you just want to learn about both. As you can see, there was a reason why I wanted to put these together, because I think if you're learning that the Empyrean II just came out and there's some rightful hype behind it, it's $3,000, and that doesn't mean you should necessarily rule out one for $4,000 if you're already spending that kind of money. Maybe this is a better sound presentation for what you're looking for. So to quickly summarize, they're both almost equally comfortable. They're insanely comfortable. They're built really well. Comparable price. This has a darker, almost slightly wider, more nuanced sound presentation, whereas the Empyrean II is a little bit more traditional V-shaped. It has more warmth, and it has much more bite and presence in the vocal region. If you want the vocals to step forward more in the mix, or you listen to electronic music and you want the synth to stand out, you want the guitar to be much more forward, the Empyrean II is a better choice for that. But overall, thanks to EQ and the exceptionally low distortion that these headphones have, they can really be pushed to high volume, so they take EQ really well also. So anyway, hope you found this helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd love to see you at the next video. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time. Bye.